A voice instructor challenged the student in the back to demonstrate proper vocal technique. It was Dean Martin visiting class, and what happened in the next 6 minutes became the most legendary moment in Hollywood music education history, proving that sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones without credentials. It was a Thursday afternoon in October 1967, and Dean Martin was doing a favor for an old friend, Tony Benedetto, not the famous singer Tony Bennett, but a vocal instructor at the Hollywood Academy of Music, had been Dean's neighbor in Beverly Hills for years. They'd had countless late-night conversations about vocal technique, performance style, and the music business over drinks on Dean's patio. Tony had mentioned he was teaching an advanced vocal performance class that semester, and had jokingly invited Dean to sit in sometime. Come see how the kids are learning these days. You might be surprised or horrified by what passes for proper technique now. Dean had decided to take him up on it. He showed up to Tony's Thursday afternoon class wearing a casual sweater, slacks, and sunglasses. Tony had introduced him to the class simply as "my friend Dean, sitting in today," without using his last name. Tony wanted to see if any of the students would recognize the king of cool without the tuxedo and stage lights. The class was advanced vocal performance, focusing on breath control, pitch accuracy, microphone technique, and professional stage presence. About 18 students, ranging from teenagers to people in their 30s, all serious about pursuing careers in music. They sat in rows with music stands, notebooks, and dreams of making it in Hollywood. But Tony wasn't teaching today. He'd called in sick, legitimately sick with the flu, not just to set up Dean's visit, and the substitute instructor was someone Dean didn't know. His name was Professor William Sterling, and according to the introduction he'd given the class, he had a master's degree in vocal performance from Juilliard, had studied with several famous opera singers, and had been teaching classical and popular vocal techniques for 15 years. Professor Sterling was technically proficient. Dean could hear that immediately. His voice was precise, controlled, and academically perfect. But there was something rigid about his approach, something that suggested he believed there was only one correct way to sing professionally. Dean settled into a chair in the back row and just listened. This would be interesting. Professor Sterling was demonstrating proper breath support technique, using a piano at the front of the class. His approach was methodical and measured, like a laboratory experiment. This is the correct way to execute professional breath support, Professor Sterling was explaining while demonstrating. Diaphragmatic breathing only, never shallow chest breathing. Posture must be perfectly upright. Shoulders back, spine straight. Mouth opens exactly 2 fingers width, no more no less. Jaw completely relaxed, tongue positioned low and forward. He sang a scale exercise. Technically flawless, but emotionally sterile. This is the standard taught at Juilliard. At all serious conservatories, it's physiologically optimized for vocal health and maximum efficiency. Any deviation from these positions will result in inconsistent tone, limited range, and potential vocal damage over time. A student raised her hand. A young woman with sheet music spread across her lap. What about singers who use different breathing techniques or mouth positions? I've heard recordings where singers approach it differently, and they sound great. Professor Sterling cut her off with a patient but condescending shake of his head. Those are improper techniques. They might work temporarily, especially for singers with exceptional natural talent who can compensate for technical deficiencies, but they create harmful habits that will limit vocal development and potentially damage the voice. He adjusted his tie and continued with authority. There is only one biomechanically correct way to sing professionally, the way I'm demonstrating. It's been studied, measured, and validated by voice science. If you can't execute proper technique, you're not ready for professional performance. You need to build the correct foundation first. Dean shifted in his seat, increasingly bothered by the absolutism. That wasn't true. Dean's own vocal technique was completely different from what Professor Sterling was prescribing. His posture was relaxed, almost casual. His breathing was natural, not forced into rigid patterns. His mouth position varied, depending on the song and emotion he was conveying, and it had worked fine for 20 years. Professor Sterling continued, warming to his favorite subject. The problem with self-taught singers is they develop these idiosyncratic techniques that feel natural but are fundamentally wrong from a physiological standpoint. They're working against their own anatomy instead of with it. Proper instruction eliminates those harmful habits before they become permanent. He gestured toward a poster of famous singers on the wall. That's why formal education is so valuable. It gives you the correct approach from the beginning, before you can develop the bad habits that plague untrained vocalists. Another student raised his hand. A teenager, with a Dean Martin album, visible in his notebook. But what about Dean Martin? His vocal style is completely different from what you're showing us. He's really relaxed, almost conversational. His posture is casual, and he doesn't seem to use the rigid breathing you're teaching, and he's obviously successful. Professor Sterling smiled in a way that suggested he'd been waiting for this question, that he had a prepared lecture ready. Dean Martin is a perfect example of natural talent overcoming poor technique. Yes, his approach is unorthodox. Yes, it clearly worked for him in the entertainment industry. I'm not denying his commercial success or popularity, but from a pedagogical standpoint, he could have been even greater with proper formal training. Dean felt his eyebrows rise behind his sunglasses. His technique is inefficient, physiologically suboptimal. Professor Sterling continued. He compensated with exceptional natural charisma and thousands of hours of practice. But for students learning today, there's no reason to adopt his inefficient methods when we have access to scientifically correct vocal training. Dean spoke up from the back row, keeping his voice neutral and casual. Actually, there are several ways to approach vocal performance. Different techniques work for different singers and different musical styles. The entire class turned to look at him. Professor Sterling stopped mid-demonstration, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "I'm sorry," Professor Sterling said, with barely concealed irritation. "Are you teaching this class? Do you have advanced vocal training credentials?" "No credentials," Dean admitted with a slight smile. "Just experience." Professor Sterling set down his sheet music and crossed his arms. "Well, experience without proper training usually leads to harmful vocal habits. That's the entire point of formal education, to correct the mistakes that self-taught singers inevitably make." He looked at Dean more carefully, seeing just a regular middle-aged guy in sunglasses and a sweater. "But since you seem to think you know better than established vocal pedagogy, why don't you come up here and demonstrate your alternative approach for the class?" The challenge was clear and condescending. Professor Sterling was expecting to embarrass a student who'd spoken out of turn by exposing his amateur technique. Dean looked at the 18 students, all watching this exchange with fascination. He glanced at the empty chair where Tony should have been sitting. Tony would have absolutely loved this moment. Dean stood up and walked to the front of the class. Professor Sterling gestured toward the microphone stand. "Please, show the class your unorthodox technique. Let's hear what untrained experience sounds like compared to proper vocal instruction." Dean approached the microphone and adjusted it slightly. Before he sang anything, he addressed Professor Sterling directly. "Can I ask you something first? What? Do you know who Dean Martin is?" Professor Sterling looked confused by the question. "Of course, we just discussed him. Natural talent, poor technique, could have been better with formal training. Why are you asking?" "Because I'm Dean Martin," Dean said calmly, removing his sunglasses. "And I'd like to demonstrate why different approaches to singing aren't wrong, they're just different." The classroom exploded. Students gasped, some screamed. Others immediately started taking pictures. Professor Sterling's face went from condescending confidence to absolute shock, then to mortification as he realized what he had just said. "You're what?" Professor Sterling stammered. "Dean Martin," Dean repeated with his trademark smile. "And you just told a classroom full of students that I could have been even better with proper training. I'm curious what proper training would have taught me that 20 years of performing didn't." Professor Sterling sat down heavily in the instructor's chair, his face pale with embarrassment. Dean addressed the class directly, his voice warm and conversational. Here's the thing about vocal technique, kids. There is no single correct way to sing. There are efficient ways and inefficient ways. Approaches that work for you and approaches that don't. But the idea that there's only one physiologically correct method, that's just not true. He demonstrated his natural vocal style, singing a few bars of That's Amore exactly as he would on stage. Relaxed posture, natural breathing, casual mouth position, everything Professor Sterling had called incorrect. This is how I sing. It's different from what Professor Sterling showed you. It's not wrong. It's adapted to my voice, my style, my musical goals. I've been doing it this way since 1946. No vocal damage, no problems. It works for me. He sang through several different styles, showing how his technique adapted to different songs. Ballads with softer breath control, up-tempo numbers with more energy, intimate songs with conversational phrasing. See? Multiple approaches for different musical contexts. Your job as a singer isn't to find the correct technique. It's to find your technique, the one that works for your voice and your music. Professor Sterling tried to recover some dignity. Mr. Martin, I didn't mean to suggest that your success wasn't legitimate. You said I could have been even better with proper training. Dean interrupted gently. What did you mean by that? Professor Sterling fumbled for words. I just meant theoretically from an academic standpoint. You meant that self-taught singers have bad habits, Dean said without anger. And that's sometimes true. I absolutely have habits that a classical instructor would consider incorrect. But those incorrect habits are part of my sound. They're part of what makes my singing recognizable as Dean Martin. He gestured to the class. If I had been trained to sing correctly according to rigid academic standards, I might have lost the very thing that made me successful. My casual, natural approach is what people connect with. Dean handed the microphone to a student in the front row. Can you sing something? Anything you're working on? The student, nervous but excited, sang a scale exercise using exactly the technique Professor Sterling had demonstrated. Perfect posture, rigid breathing, mechanical precision. That's technically correct, Dean said encouragingly. But it sounds stiff. You're so focused on doing everything right that you're not letting your personality come through. Try it again. But this time, forget about the rules. Just sing it like you're talking to a friend. The student tried it again, more relaxed and natural. It immediately sounded more musical, more human. See, Dean said to the class, technique should serve the music and your personality. The music and your personality shouldn't serve the technique. Professor Sterling is right that there are efficient ways to sing, but efficiency isn't the ultimate goal. Communication is the goal. Connection with your audience is the goal. For the remaining 30 minutes of class, Dean essentially taught the entire session. He showed multiple approaches to breath control, explained how to adapt technique to different musical styles, demonstrated how unconventional techniques could create unique sounds, and emphasized feeling and communication over mechanical perfection. Professor Sterling sat to the side, watching his class be taken over by someone without formal credentials, without academic degrees, without any of the qualifications Sterling had spent years accumulating. And Dean was doing it better than Sterling ever had. When class ended, students surrounded Dean with questions, requests for autographs, and thanks for the impromptu lesson. Several asked for career advice, which Dean gave generously and practically. Professor Sterling approached hesitantly after the crowd of students had dispersed. Mr. Martin, I owe you a profound apology. What I said about you needing proper training was incredibly arrogant and ignorant. Hey, you didn't know who I was, Dean said, without any resentment. You were teaching what you believed. The problem isn't that you challenged me. The problem is that you told students there's only one right way. That shuts down creativity and personal expression. I thought I was helping them avoid harmful mistakes, Professor Sterling said. Some mistakes are how you discover your own sound, Dean replied. Some of my most distinctive vocal qualities came from doing things that weren't textbook correct, but sounded right to me. If I had been trained to only sing properly, I never would have found my style. Dean turned back to address the class one final time. How many of you are here because you want to sound exactly like someone else? No hands went up. Right. You're here because you want to develop your own voice, literally and figuratively. Professor Sterling's approach would make you all technically proficient, but you might all sound the same. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to break rules if breaking them helps you express something true. After Dean left, Professor Sterling had to face his students, many of whom were looking at him with new skepticism about his rigid methods. One brave student asked, "Is there really only one correct way to sing professionally?" Professor Sterling took a deep breath. No, Dean Martin is absolutely right. I've been teaching techniques as if they're immutable laws. They're not. They're tools, guidelines. I apologize for being so dogmatic. The story spread through the Hollywood Academy of Music within hours. The substitute professor who told Dean Martin he needed proper training became an instant legend. Sterling became known for the incident, but he also became a better teacher. He started emphasizing individual expression over rigid correctness, creativity over mechanical perfection. When Tony Benedetto returned to teach the following week, his students could barely contain their excitement telling him what had happened. Tony called Dean that evening, laughing. "You visited one class I wasn't even teaching, and you still managed to revolutionize my entire program." "I was just sitting there, pal," Dean protested. "The substitute challenged me." The substitute told Dean Martin he could have been better with proper training, Tony said. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I'm devastated that I missed it." Years later, Professor Sterling would tell the story differently than he had experienced it. In his version, he had recognized Dean immediately and had invited him to demonstrate as a special guest. But the students who were there remembered the truth, and they told the real story for decades. The lesson Dean taught that day became part of Hollywood Academy folklore. Students would reference the Dean Martin principle when discussing the balance between technical training and individual expression. If this story of unexpected wisdom and the power of authentic artistry moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that rules are meant to guide, not restrict creativity. Have you ever learned more from breaking conventional wisdom than following it? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the artists who proved that sometimes the best technique is the one that's uniquely yours.